first, just a little bit about me. That is a picture of me doing my favorite thing that I get to do at work, which is helping scientists develop their main messages. In this case, this was a meeting at the American Geophysical Union, a workshop with about 50 scientists, and help them develop their messages and then practice delivering those messages in interviews, which is one of the things that I tend to do at a workshop. Places that I hang out online when I talk about science communication, so you can find me on Twitter. Reach me at aaron@catercommunications.com. That's the firm that I work with. I also write about science communication and publish resources at sciencecommunicationmedia.com. Trellis is a cool online platform that AAS runs, and I think anybody can just request to be a member. There's a lot of really rich discussions there, including stuff that I don't work on, like education policy and things like that, if that's what you're into. The Global Network for Science Communication is also a really robust science communication Facebook group, so I also recommend joining that. And I'm on there chatting about all good things SciComm too. A little bit more background about me. I got my start in science communication. Let me make sure this slide works. This is the tokamak test fusion generator at Princeton, New Jersey. And my uncle Matt, who is a physics teacher, took me there when I was 12 years old. And I was kind of a science geek. I was really into sci-fi. I really loved science. I loved, Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I had the illustrated version of that. Read a lot of Carl Sagan. So a chance to go to a physics lab and meet some, true-to-life physicists. And as a 12-year-old, getting to go around this facility, getting to talk to experimental physicists and ask them questions about their work and what they were trying to do with fusion energy, I was really blown away, and I was really excited by this tour. And at the time, I thought, I really want to be a scientist when I grow up. That's what fascinates me. But to the tour, and the person who had taken us around, the tour guide, he said, you're really lucky that you're here because this lab might not be here next year. And we went, well, why? And because we're going to run out of congressional funding. So if you know a member of Congress, or if you have some friends who know a member of Congress, please tell them what a great visit you had today at the lab. And that was such a wake-up call for me because I never had really seen the connection between science and the rest of society before. And I got to have that big wake-up call at 12. And I was really drawn toward communications when I was a student. I was really into writing and public speaking. I realized that this role that you can play in science, doing science communication, helping explain why research is important, matters. I currently do this a bit at Cater Communications. It's a bipartisan PR firm. We work a lot on clean energy and climate issues. We work a bit on public health, too. So it's a big family of issues, and we're a public interest firm. So I get to work with a lot of researchers and scientists through my day job now. I have my side project, Science Communication Media, and I was with the Union of Concerned Scientists for about 10 years, and they actually pointed you all my way for today's webinar, and I did a lot of work there, too. Blogged about science communication there for a while, too. Their blog is called The Equation. It's got some stuff there. Message development is, like I said, a fundamental skill. It's useful for shaping what your main points are going to be for a public talk, the main points you want to emphasize during a press conference. Message development skills are also useful for more kind of prosaic tasks that we think about that are still very much science communication. So if you're a group that's writing a major assessment report, you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about message development and figuring out, okay, what goes in the executive summary, what goes in the press release related to this report. It's also very true if you're doing congressional testimony. This was one of my favorite piece of congressional testimony in the past couple of years. This is John Holdren and Jane Lubchenco testifying about the impacts of ocean acidification. My favorite is because Lubchenco actually did a science experiment at this congressional hearing, and you'll see she had some beakers and flasks there, and she demonstrated what ocean acidification looks like live as members of Congress. So she kind of didn't do the normal testimony thing. She had her main messages, but she backed it up by doing a live science experiment. And we'll talk about that a little bit later and how you can have some fun and think about making your messages really impactful and memorable too. The main role of message development is distillation. And I know most of you work on water, so hopefully this is a good graphic. I think it's a good metaphor. When we're distilling, we're taking the most fundamental things, the essence of the messages that we want to convey, and we talk about boiling main messages down, right? It's kind of that same process. We want to identify the most important things that the audience to come away with. And what we don't want to do, why I like this metaphor of distillation, is we don't want to oversimplify, because when we oversimplify, we essentially give our audience an inaccurate centric perspective of the messages that we want to convey. So I think distillation and making something simple and understandable without oversimplifying or making something simplistic, that's kind of the end goal when we're doing message development. Development is important for guidance when you're doing pictures. I'll go back to that real quick. This is a pocket message guide that a meteorologist named Scott Mandia uses, a meteorology professor, and he does a lot of climate communication. So when he does an interview, he has these 4 main messages for all of his interviews that he prints out on a card that he keeps in his wallet. And he has another version that he pins above his desk. So guidance, when he's doing a media interview, he makes sure that he hits those 4 points there, right? And those 4 points are that climate change is occurring, it's largely caused by human activities, that scientists have broad agreement about some basics on climate change, and that our emissions choices still matter quite a bit for what future climate change looks like. So he's not literally reading off that card, but what that main message card does for him is when he's giving an interview, he gets to kind of check off all of those main messages as he goes along, and it serves as a reminder that he doesn't want to get tangent. He wants to come back to all of those main messages. That's why it's worth putting in that message development work at a time. Message development is also important for organization. It's kind of like a big recipe book. One of my former colleagues, Gretchen Goldman, she's an editor by training, and this is really how she likes to do message development. So she'll have a full report like this, and she'll have pieces of it that she knows she can break off for different message purposes. If she only has 1 minute to somebody, I'm going to just peel off one part of it. If she has somebody who's interested in just one aspect of that report, she has it really organized into briefing books like this. So this is how you can take all the science that you're working on, make it easily accessible, self-organize it through a message development process, and then reflect it back out to people based on needs. It's important for managing attention and thinking about the different levels of attention that people can pay to science communication activities. So through message development, you're going to wind up with, again, what an old colleague of mine who does a lot of great web writing named Matt Hyde used to talk about was your 1 second, your second, and your 1 minute plus messages. So now does a really good job with 1 second messages on Twitter. People to where they can get more information, but they understand that people are seeking for information online a lot, so whatever the main conclusion of a study is or what they want to point to, this was the big finding they had about liquid water potentially flowing on present-day Mars. So this is their 1 second message, right? And so this is a USGS Facebook post. It's somebody who maybe is going to have 10 seconds to look through 2 or 3 paragraphs, read a little bit, and a link if they want to go deeper. Your longer messages, so this is a ProPublica podcast, and they do a lot of deep reporting. So this is a 18-minute segment they did on how the Flint water crisis happened. And this is the sort of stuff that most scientists really like doing when it's time to do media interviews and when it's time to convey public messages, because you can actually go in depth, right? That's why a lot of scientists are public fans too, right? You can actually go in depth with this. Now, to do that all the time? No, unfortunately not. So our main message development, we still have to think about the 1 second and the 10 second. We like being in that 1 minute plus space when we think about how to help an audience make our science given the time that they have to actually get the science communication messages. One thing that you want to develop main messages is you want to spend time thinking about how to make your messages interesting and memorable. So that picture right there, the guy that you see in the middle, that's Conan O'Brien, and this is the old Simpsons writer's room from the 80s. I think one of the really fun aspects of science communication is trying to come up with what are the cool, fun hooks, what are the neat, interesting ways we can communicate about our work that's going to stick with people. I think that's one of the big goals of message development, is coming up with sticky messages so that when people come back to the topic later or think about the topic later, they had to say that they have some real concrete takeaways that have stuck in their heads. And we'll talk about the methods for doing that a little bit later, too. So all that, those are kind of the principles and the goals that I go into message development with. Approach to message development is to borrow a little bit of the philosophy of Bruce Lee. And I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but one of the things that made Bruce Lee an incredible martial artist in his time is that he was not wedded to any one school of martial art. He thought, martial arts have something to offer, but depending on what I want to do, how tall I am, what my reach is, how hard I can kick, if I like grappling or jumping or whatever, I'm going to pick and choose little bits of all these different martial arts that I make my own thing. And he developed a martial arts system called Jeet Kune Do, and he would say it's a form without form. You pick and choose what works for you and what works for the situation. And I tend to approach message development the same way. I'm going to walk you through a bunch of different types of message templates, and I think the big lesson here is that none of them have an answer for message development. There's no one way to do this. You gotta just try stuff out. You gotta trust yourself. You gotta adapt it to your audience and your communications task. And we're over about 4 or 5 of them with symbols, so we'll get into the meat of it now. So how a basic message template works. This is a basic message template that we developed at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Message 1, here's what we know. Message new, and it's going to tell you here's why it matters. And to put that in more scientific terms, we're going to do the basic science. We've got and explain the implications for scientists or society. And you can see how this sort of follows the rubric of a scientific paper, or an abstract, or maybe the discussion portion of a scientific paper. This is kind of the essence of introducing any new research out into the world. So here's an example I did with some public health researchers. Basic science for this particular study, the second highest rate of HIV in the world, and it's the leading cause of death for people that are aged 20 to 59. Their finding was that tourism areas combine a number of risk factors, including drug use, sex work, and population mixing. And what's the implication? This finding can inform where we target HIV interventions. Straightforward, right? This is. Let's just summarize this. Let's get it into the template, and that's kind of step 1. Right? This is usually the simpler part. Step 2 is how can we think about conveying all of these points a little bit more creatively so that they stick, that they resonate with people a little bit more, that they can go, aha, and let them remember what you had to say. And some of that is getting rid of like a little bit of jargon, right? So I don't know how many public health folks are on, but terms like population mixing or terms like interventions, that's going to get lost in some audiences. An audience of peers, they'll definitely get it. Audiences that pay attention to public health stuff and medical stuff, they'll be able to piece it together. But depending on who you're talking to, you might need to find some alternative ways of explaining that. They might get lost in it a little bit. Jargon, we also came up with some different ways of saying this. So this is, we workshopped it a little bit, what we came up with. Basic science. There are many people living in California as are living in the Caribbean, but countries have twice as many people living with HIV. Longer message, but we think, for a domestic audience, we could work. If people don't have a sense of how big the Caribbean is or how many people live there, what's some social math we can use to help illustrate that, right? California's got a lot of people, Caribbean's got a lot of people. Here's the thing, the Caribbean have twice as many people living with HIV. So that makes the whole rate point that they wanted to make a little bit clearer and a little bit more resonant for a domestic audience. Finding HIV thrives where drugs, sex work, and people come together, and that's in major tourism areas. Reverse this to say, here's where it thrives, and here's where that is, right? You kind of discover the answer at the end of this sentence. And population mixing, that's where people come together, right? We simplified that language a little bit. Implication, we know that tourism hotspots are HIV hotspots too. So it's a little bit of a cliche there, but we're playing off of that double meaning of hotspot, right, which people are somewhat familiar with thanks to metal thriller writings and things like that. And the idea that the tourism industry refers to places as hotspots that you really want to visit that are, big fun destinations. So I'll go back to this. So this was kind of the drier messages here, and we'll have copies of the slide. We'll have a recording, so you can go back to this later. And this workshopping took a while, but we got it to a point where these could be quotes in a press release, they could be openers to a talk, they could be pieces of text that you underline or have in call-out boxes in a report. That's the distillation process, right? We're coming up with the things that we want to stick for our audience. The template we developed over at UCS, and this is more of a policy-focused message. So this is, in particular, if you're dealing with public policy issues, local, state, federal level, you have stuff on the table that you want policymakers to consider or do. And this applies for stuff that you might want to get people to do if you want them to, say, participate in a citizen science project, a policy-focused or action-focused message template. Message template problem, what a project is trying to address. What's the problem, what's the issue that we're trying to tackle? What research suggests could address that problem. Steps or series of steps can flow from those studied solutions. So, get specific for different audiences. What can you do in response to this? And find benefits. What societal goals are served by following these actions? And those benefits for the scientific community, too. These are all pretty flexible tools. So I'll walk you through an example here. A study I did, a study I helped promote with Jelon White Newsom, who's a public health researcher who studied the intersection of health and climate change pretty extensively. So this particular research paper, these were the main messages that we came up with. At the basic level, let's get the distilled stuff down on paper. The problem is that low-income seniors are becoming more vulnerable to heat-related illness as the climate warms. And she was specifically looking at seniors who live in high-rise apartment buildings that often don't have air conditioning. The solution, we found that senior centers with strong community bonds are better able to respond to extreme heat. What that buildings should come up with heat response plans and identify floor captains who can check on their neighbors. So very specific at the building floor level. There were other recommendations there. There were other actions that we slotted into this template. Cooling centers and sort of city level things. It really depended on who we were talking to. In this case, we were talking to people who were just right in the middle of a heat wave. So it's like what's something you can do now in your own building. And benefits, these plans can save lives at little to no cost. Okay. Everything up a little bit. We restated the problem this way. For many older Americans, summers are hotter than they remember, and that can be dangerous for low-income seniors in particular. So this is kind of a perspective shifting message, right? It's put yourself in the shoes of an older American, or if you are one, just think about what summers used to be like, and leading the audience along to the main message instead of just telling them, relating it back to their personal experiences. And we built that later, related work with some infographics where it was, really picturing what the summer was like for somebody in the 1960s, for your mom or your grandma, we're targeting a younger audience, and then picture what it's like today. So really picture those people, the clothes they're wearing, the skills, what that world was like, and trigger that for people and make them think about this kind of longer-term climatic change that we're dealing with. Solution, we restated it this way. Strong communities are safe communities, and that's true when we're talking about extreme heat, too. So communities are safe communities. This isn't blockbuster stuff. It's just a little bit of alliteration, and a little bit of alliteration can really help. It can be as simple as having a floor captain who can check on their neighbors as part of a heat response plan. So just emphasizing that it's simple. It's as simple as having a floor captain. That in the middle of a heat wave, a knock on someone's door can save someone's life, right? So just bringing in that sound, helping paint a picture for people a little bit, and really emphasizing the stakes of the benefits and how huge the benefits are compared to how simple the solution and the actions are. So that's how we punched that up, and we did a whole radio tour around that was really effective and resonant. Happy with. We felt like we got the message across really clearly. I don't know if folks have heard of Compass. They're pretty big in the marine science world. They've done a lot of stuff on wildfires too. Really neat organization. They have a broader message template you can take a look at too, and I'll cover this briefly. You're not going to be able to read all this, but you can just see how they structure it. And similar, they have the right in the center, and you talk about the problem. In this case, this is a scientist named Sarah Murray who was releasing some research about marine ecosystems and how they respond to very long-term climate change. So she had the problem she studied. There's things related to reducing emissions. There's benefits that can flow from those solutions. And you notice here, I really like what she did on the left. She had benefits for science and scientists, and she had benefits for climate change decision makers, for policymakers. So depending on which audience she was talking to and what she wanted to emphasize, she was able to slot that into this box, this message template. And so what? Why should people care? And I like that they emphasize this in that message box because it forces you to think about what the takeaways are when you're developing the main messages and thinking about what those entry points are for really building on something and conveying your science to your type of message template that we're gonna spend time on because this is really, really useful. I've found that it undergirds a lot of the other thing that is out there about how to develop main messages. Houston, we have a narrative by Randy Olson, Why Science Needs Stories. Why Science Needs Stories. I would call this book a must-read for anyone who's interested in science communication, any kind of academic communication. It's very narrative-based. Randy Olson's a neat guy. He's a scientist turned filmmaker. He developed his passion for filmmaking. He left a tenured position, went to film school, was older than everybody else in the film school, has a lot of crazy stories from being around and living in Hollywood as a very logical-minded scientist. Having narrative thinking kind of beaten into him by going through film school. He's thought pretty deeply about this. I think what's important is that most of how we tend to think about and remember things is narrative-based. And if you have a good story to tell, if you have a good story to share, that it's really going to hit that memorability act of developing good messages. And he has a template that he calls the ABT to ABT, and, but, therefore. This really resonated with me as a science communicator. He said that, our tendency in science communication is to start with and I want more, and I have more facts, and I have more data, and I have more analysis, and this aspect of the research is important, and this aspect is research. That's important too, and, right? So we wind up with science communication where we're often trying to just jam a lot of facts and information into a limited amount of space. We're just linking everything to and, right? So we wind up overwhelming some of our audiences with the data and not remembering anything. They don't realize how all those ands, all those facts are interconnected with each other. It's hard for them to pull it into a cohesive narrative. So you have a lot of ands, but and a therefore. You have to show them where the tension is in the scientific research, what new thing you're trying to uncover, or what new thing in society is being challenged because of the science, and what's the therefore? What is therefore? What is the takeaway? What's the thing that we should do or think about differently? So I think it's very powerful. It's very fundamental. I'll take you through some examples. I'll take you through a pretty straightforward one he uses in the book first. This is right near my old hometown in Jersey. This is the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in Seaside Heights, and this was a huge wake-up call for folks who deal with coastal planning. New Jersey is really highly developed. The building is just right up to the shore, and I did a lot of work at the time on sea level rise. We're trying to bake sea level rise into civic planning at a lot of different levels of government, and this is the ABT that Randy came up with when he was working with some sea level rise researchers on a series of presentations they were giving. For 18 years, sea level has been stable. Civilizations have been built right up to the edge of the ocean, but for the past 150 years, sea levels have been rising rapidly. Therefore, it is now time to come up with a new management plan for coastal areas. There's actually, this is straightforward to us as science communication people, right? But what's cool about the ABT template is they were able to attach a lot, hang a lot of stuff off this. So like when they were giving public talks and lectures, that sense for 8,000 years, sea levels have been stable. That's a big part of a lecture. And that story about civilization being built right up to the edge of the ocean, that's another big part of the lecture, right? What happens? Well, now sea level has been rising rapidly. It's a change. It's a big difference that scientists have noticed. It's challenging their thinking about how this stuff usually works. And therefore, what does the future look like? What do people come away with? And you could be expanding this out, right, and hanging a lot of things off of all those different aspects of the message. This could be 3 chapters in a report. A series of presentations by multiple scientists during a big panel about sea level rise. These could be different speakers tackling each part of this as part of a press conference, right? But the important thing is we've distilled it down to just those key elements that we want people to remember. One thing that is really important to bring in the context of talking about narrative is, narrative is a really powerful tool. And the word narrative can sometimes make logical, science-minded people like me a little bit uncomfortable, and because narratives can also be misleading. So I want to be clear that in thinking about using a based message template and distilling your stuff down at this level, of course always want our messages to be accurate, right? And I think this is actually an important point because when we're fighting misleading narratives and we try to fight them with just the facts, with and, it's playing the same game. With a misleading narrative out there about a scientific topic, you try to fire facts at it, nothing seems to stick. Those facts have to be understood within the context of a narrative. And if they're understood within the context of a narrative, they're memorable, they work for people, they come away with it with a better concept, something they can hang on to, and receive the message and retain the message in a more effective way. I'm going to use two or three concrete examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. And I'll take an example from so-called vaccine autism controversy, right, and the misperceptions that people have about risks associated with vaccinating their kids. He's been pushing for, freedom for parents to opt out of the vaccine regimens. She thinks that her kid suffers from autism because of exposure through vaccines, and she has a very stimulating message. Vaccines are widely administered, and no one questions them. But when my child received vaccines, he became autistic. Therefore, we must be suspicious of vaccines. Right? This is the basic message that she had to share, and this completely freaks out nutritionists, epidemiologists. They really struggled with this. And there's a researcher named Paul Offit who has probably done more public communication around vaccines and the efficacy and the safety and the real, risks associated with vaccines and the real concrete risks of not vaccinating your kids. He's been all over it, and I think he's just one of the most effective science communicators out there. And I have a really short interview with him. It's on the Science Communication Media YouTube page, and it's just masterful. He just nails all of his message points. He's got his main messages down, and importantly, he's got his main messages structured in a narrative way that's memorable. CBS interview, and I talked to Olson about this, and we played around with it for a while, and we figured out where Offit was hitting these narrative notes and giving people some structure to hang on to. Messages was structured like this: I sympathize with parents who worry about this. That's kind of the and, right? And the and here, but it's kind of understood. But thankfully, these are scientific questions with scientific answers. Therefore, we can trust the science. I sympathize with parents who worry about this, and it's a big problem, but these are scientific questions with scientific answers. They can trust the science, right? And just that structural change and that little bit of empathy and that transition over to why we should be able to trust the science and why this is a scientific topic and not one that people should just be scared and irrational about. It's really helpful. It helps hang all the messages on there. It's not him just saying, well, here's a report and here's another report and trust me and this is what the CDC says and this is what another scientific authority says, right? He's not doing and. He's hooking it to a narrative structure like this. He also has a little story that he tells, and I presented on this with some public health folks, and one of them had heard Paul Offit tell this story many, 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 many times. She was like, oh, I know that. I've heard Paul talk about this way too many times, actually. What that told me was that it's a really effective story, and it's one he found that resonates with audiences. So here's the whole story, and this is exactly how he tells it. My wife was ready to give a child a vaccine, and as she was pulling the shot into the syringe, the child had a seizure. If the seizure had come after the shot, it would have been very difficult to convince the parents they weren't connected. Therefore, we can't trust anecdotes. We have to trust the scientific method. And, I think that's a great way of illustrating where people's thinking is getting away from the science, why science is important. It's very concrete. Right? And it's not just saying trust the science, or he says at another point in the interview, he quotes Carl Sagan, and he says, well, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But it's not quite enough, especially if you're trying to combat a pervasive narrative that runs counter to the science out there. You need to come up with your own accurate, well-narrative. It's a little heady. I hope it also seems useful, though. I think if you work with the ABT template a lot, it starts to make more and more sense, and you start to see how it undergirds some of these other structures we talked about, like problem, solution, action can also be restated as an and, but, therefore. And you can actually have all of your main messages. You can kind of do what Paul Offit did here and have a little story about messages that helps convey them. Right? You can build this stuff out over time and with it and see what works for your audience. are some tools that I use when thinking about how I want to convey main messages. So after we've gotten to that point, okay, these are your main messages. How are we going to make them memorable? These are also from another book called Scientist's Guide to Talking with the Media, produced by the Union of Concerned Scientists. So putting your findings in perspective, it's the biggest, it's the longest, it's the strongest, it's the newest, it's the most interesting, it's the most innovative. Why is this noteworthy? Why should people care? What's cool about it, right? And what's that broader perspective? What are the bigger trends that you're seeing? Don't just tell me that Arctic ice is growing rapidly this year. Put it in a longer-term perspective for me. One of the most interesting quotes from a guy named Mark Cerise, who studies Arctic ice for a living. He calls it the shrinking Arctic ice, the Arctic death spiral. Well, that's perspective, doesn't it? It's a very memorable quote. It's a little despondent. But it's helpful, so it works on that level. Metaphors and analogies. Metaphors and analogies can be really powerful. They can be unintentionally misleading, too. So we want to be careful with those. Painting a picture. So one of the things that we got with Jalan's messages about the public health and heat research, picture, making people what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes or to be where you are as a scientist. What's it like measuring stream flow, and dangling off a bridge to get a water sample. Paint a picture for folks, right? Structure and alliteration, that's kind of an English major way of approaching it. We went over some of those examples. Social math, like the California example. Showing a little emotion can be a good thing. And I think scientists have gotten more and more comfortable with this. They realize that, that human side of your research too, and what makes you curious and passionate about your work and what it's like to have a big discovery. And cliches and cultural references can be a lot of fun, too. One of my favorite science quotes from the past couple of years was when one of the astronomical societies was debating whether or not Pluto was a planet. Somebody put a proposal on the table that would vastly expand the number of planets in the solar system. And one of the scientists who didn't like that plan called it a no ice ball left behind policy, right? So playing off of the no child left behind education policy of the era. So stuff like that, that can be funny and silly. You see people do this with, the CDC had a really good example a couple years ago. They built a whole disaster preparedness campaign around the idea of preparing for a zombie apocalypse. Which, oh my gosh, I would have loved to have been in the room when somebody ran that up the flagpole at the CDC. But they got it approved, and it actually worked real well. Took the zombie craze in the broader culture and said, okay, let's suspend our science for a second. If this were real, if this were really happening, what would you do? And it turns out all these disaster preparedness messages they had for things that happen, like floods and wildfires and sort of stuff, they would also apply to a zombie apocalypse. So they hit that main message in a way that got people to pay attention and take steps related to disaster preparedness, which was, the goal of their communication anyway. So, have a little fun with those. Be careful with them. Don't go down a weird rabbit hole or pick weird cultural references. But if you can make it work, oh my gosh, they work so well. And I had one, I keep a running list of sound bites, and one was water related, and hopefully this resonates for a lot of you. This was, again, one of the Flint stories from the New York Times. Zoo, a doctoral student, went to collect samples at the Flint hospital looking for signs of the bacteria that causes Legionnaires. And here's a quote. When I turned on the tap, you see this corrosive, reddish-brown tap water. It's that moment that made it so real. Corrosive, reddish-brown tap water. Yuck. You can see why a reporter would pick up on that and say, oh, it's a really good soundbite. I want that in my story. That's so memorable. That's so visceral. It's like it really makes you feel like you're there, right? And that's useful for her to illustrate the type of scientific work that she's doing. Another skill that you can use to get creative with your main messages and think about how you can make messages that stick is improv exercises. The background there, a little bit of focus. You can see Alan Alda. I hope folks are familiar with some of the work that he's done. He's really passionate about science communication. He's spending a lot of time helping scientists communicate more effectively about their work, and doing that through improv exercises. And if you get time, doing improv exercises is such a useful skill in science communication. And it's because it's built around the concept of yes and rather than no but. And some of you have probably already heard this before, but just to illustrate this, I think all of us have had the experience of working in science communication, coming up with main messages, and our peers say, no, that's inaccurate. No, that won't work. No, I don't like it. No, they're going to get the wrong idea. No. And I think, one of the things I love about science is critical thinking, right? Bad science does not stick around forever. It will get shot down. And the culture of negation, and this is something Randy Olson talks about a little bit too, unfortunately it can cross over to communication in a way that can actually be unhelpful sometimes. So the rules that I like to use are using these yes and improv rules. No matter what you say, even if it's inaccurate, even if it seems silly, I'm going to say yes to it and I'm going to build on it, or I'm going to say yes to it and I'm going to go somewhere else with it. And with creative ways of talking about this, and eventually something's going to stick. And I use those yes and rules for internal meetings, for brainstorming, for private conversations. Nothing in a room when we're developing main messages, go for it. No one's live tweeting the brainstorming session through the institutional account, right? So if we say yes and, that kind of unlocks this creative part of brains. And then we can save the no but for when it's draft those messages and put them up on the whiteboard or the projector, or when we're messing around with them later on the word processor at home, right? That saves the no buts for. And when I've done improv exercises with scientists, it's the most freeing thing in the world to tell a scientist that temporarily, for the sake of coming up with creative ideas, you have to worry about being accurate, and you don't have to self-edit while talking or while you're writing. And they wind up saying some accurate things, but it's okay because it's in private, right, because you're experimenting. But they wind up saying some things that really get to the emotional core of their research and the message core of their research. And I remember working with a climate scientist for an improv exercise, and she said, I feel like I'm in the kitchen and I just see the needle going up on this pressure cooker and telling everyone, hey, this is really bad, this is really risky, and no one believes me, right? That isn't something that she was going to say on TV, put in a press release, whatever. But doing the improv exercise, we got to, she felt like it was important for people to listen to the climate science, right, and to heed the risks, right? I'm trying to provide the service, I'm trying to warn people, I'm trying to help people, and there's kind of that frustration and disconnect there that was really powerful. We were able to shape that and talk about it in different ways later. They're really successful in making that role of a publicly facing scientist more relatable to audiences. Quick points before we get into the Q&A. Methods. Into main messages, you're usually not going to do it. It's going to happen sometimes. If you're doing a citizen science program and you're telling people, how to collect the water samples, how to collect the bugs, whatever, methods are part of your main message. They're the action that you want people to take. Anytime you're talking about methods with your peers, with other researchers, so it can be part of a main message that you convey in the context of a scientific conference or a poster session. For the most part, and I wish it wasn't the case, most public audiences, journalists, et cetera, they don't our methods. They just kind of trust that, somebody's watching out and making sure that the methods are okay, or that, if the methods are wrong, that somebody will figure it out later. And usually, especially journalists, they just don't have time to do it. Now, what I will say is in public communication, you will get questions about your methods, and some are well-intentioned. Maybe somebody wants to challenge your work a little bit, or maybe even just play devil's advocate. So I like to tell scientists, develop some simple explanations for your methods. Absolutely be able to explain your methods to people. Unless the methods themselves seem interesting to an external audience, they're kind of a back pocket message. They're sort of secondary, right? So that's what I would say about that. Hopefully that's not too controversial. And I also think that there are legitimately interesting, cool methods you want to talk about, especially in the context of asking for more funding for scientific research, right? You have to explain why a method is new or novel or interesting, or what benefits could come from it. The kind of being stuck in your own science world, right? I think this is really tough for those of us who work in and around science. So this is from Saturday Morning Breakfast Cereal, which is a lot of science cartoons. Here's how science advocates talk about a project. Why is it important that we've trapped antimatter? Oh, it has all these great applications in propulsion, energy creation, data transmission, you name it. Scientists explain it. Why is it important that we've trapped antimatter? Because it's beep awesome, right? And I think we in science world tend to get really excited about our own stuff, and we get caught up in our own science world. And when we have those moments where we want to communicate externally, we have to step outside, and we often have to ask ourselves fundamental questions. Why is this research important? Why, it seems so obvious, but why should people keep water? right? And maybe you're not working on drinking water. That's maybe a little more direct, right? But why should you care about water and ecosystems? Why does that really matter for people, right? Asking ourselves those fundamentals and reviewing like very basic concepts about why our research is funded, who our stakeholders are, and what they're going to get out of the process. It's always good to grow messages in how those audiences are viewing the science and what's truly important, really core. I'll try to make this brief. This is a main results graph from a paper about how much trust in various professions in the world. Okay, U.S. audience is out of Princeton. So all these professions are laid out on competence. Scale cut off at 1.5 here, but a scale from 1 to 5. And so competence, how good are they at their job? How smart are they? How accomplished are they? Warmth, does they care about me, right? So kind of ignore the stuff in the middle. Look over on the right here for a second. Lawyers are viewed as highly competent, but not very warm. People think, lawyers, yeah, they're smart, they're good at what they do, but they're in it for themselves. They're doing their own thing. And similarly, that's CEOs, accountants. Now look at this cluster here: researcher, scientist, engineer. So if you do your job to somebody, I'm a researcher, I'm a scientist, or I'm an engineer, you think, okay, well, you're probably pretty competent. Like, you're handing out PhDs willy-nilly, right? You're probably a pretty smart person. And you're maybe moderate on warmth. You're kind of neutral, right? I don't know if you're super warm or super cold or whatever. But then I got what's up top here. Doctor. Well, that's warm, right? And it's because people assume that doctors have this altruistic motivation. They want to save lives. You're a teacher. Maybe you love teaching. You're picturing somebody interacting with kids in a classroom, transferring knowledge. Now, and you can see it up there too. Now check out nurse. Doctor. Okay, this is somebody who really cares. So the lesson that I take from this research and sort of the stereotypes that people have in their heads about scientists and scientific research is that we can do more to emphasize what it's silly to call them this, but what I would call the warmer aspects of science. And that gets back to what I was talking about in the last slide. You want to emphasize the why of your research, of your scientific project, why people should care. And the context of a lot of the work that I think you all do, it's the public service nature. Someone somewhere is supporting whatever scientific work you're engaged in. Very often it's taxpayers. Maybe it's a company. That company still gets an R&D tax break. It's publicly supported in a foundation. Maybe it's a local government, whatever. But somewhere it's like, this is important for a reason. I would love to see scientists emphasize more when they're talking about their research and where they fit into that public service mission that it has for us. And it's kind of the helper role and the advice role and the I guess there's no other way to put it than like public service or public interest role scientists fulfill in society. With that, I think we should go to Q&A, and then I just had like 1 or 2 wrap-up slides as we approach the hour.